This presentation is a short telling of the over-harvesting of Sarasota Bay oysters from the 1880s to the 19-teens by locals and Tampa and St. Petersburg oystermen, as reported by the local newspapers, the Manatee River Journal and the Sarasota Times. From Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, The Walrus and the Carpenter, a shortened version. "O oysters, come and walk with us," the walrus did beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than four, to give a hand to each." But Mother Oyster winked her eye and shook her weary head. She knew too well it was much too soon to leave the oyster bed. "The sea is nice, take my advice, and stay right here," Mom said. But four young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, you know, they hadn't any feet. Four other oysters followed them, and yet another four. And thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock, conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings." "But wait a bit," the oysters cried, "before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat." "No hurry," said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the walrus said, "is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed." "But not on us," the oysters cried, turning a little blue. "After such kindness that would be a dismal thing to do." "The night is fine," the walrus said. "Do you admire the view?" "It seems a shame," the walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick." The carpenter said nothing but, "The bread's spread too thick." "I weep for you," the walrus said, "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. "O oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. The oyster is a bivalve mollusk, meaning it has two shells held together by a strong muscle. The thick, larger lower shell permanently attaches itself to a hard substrate, while the top shell generally has a smaller and flatter appearance. Oysters play a valuable role in the coastline ecosystem. They are filter feeders, filtering the water around them at a rate of 25 gallons per day to feed on single-cell plants. Oysters are considered a keystone species, detoxifying their surrounding environment while providing a habitat for fish, shrimp, crabs, and other sea animals. According to the Manatee River Journal, all of Sarasota's fine oysters with a hard and flinty shell as desirable for transportation are grown a little below and above low water mark. Many of these oysters are being shipped to the large cities of the north and paying better prices per barrel than many vegetables produced, costing twice the capital and labor. Unlike the northern, the Florida oysters are exposed to the tempting gaze of the passers-by, and a few thriftless people indulge evil thoughts of wandering between suns when the pale silvery moon is silently gleaming and the honest cultivator is sweetly dreaming of what he is to realize by the investment. November of 1908. On the natural beds, the oysters spawn tremendously in the first warm months of summer. The spawn attaches itself like millions of freckles to anything affording a foothold, anything sharp like broken shells, old bottles, other oysters, and rocks. With incredible rapidity, These freckles expand, becoming spats, small fingernail oysters already housed in walls of lime. Now comes the oysterman, he of the schooner with its two big iron dredges, and he in the skiff with his tongs. Both begin to pillage the beds in long, hard days of application. The dredge comes up from the deep like a mining cage of steel. Its cargo upon its arrival is dumped upon the deck, and over the dredge goes for another. Meanwhile, a crew of furiously working men are busily culling at the heap. Scores of the oysters come up in lumpy colonies, where 6, 8, 10 or more of the creatures are cemented together in a group. The men, armed with hammers and skillful at the work, give one sharp tap, and such an aggregation and break all its units apart. A false blow might serve to kill many oysters. Having loaded her decks, the schooner goes home. Culling oysters when harvesting means breaking oysters away from what they are attached to and accepting only suitably sized oysters, currently 3 inches in length. The waste should be thrown back onto the oyster bed for new oysters to cling to. For many years before 1890, Sarasota Bay had almost limitless fish and shellfish, enough to feed the local population many times over. It was not uncommon to find those that lived inland to spend a half day on the bay and bring home several barrels of oysters. The local oyster houses run by Waddy Bacon, Albritton and Scott, and the Vincent brothers in Sarasota, and Jasper Harris in Bradentown, helped spread the fame of the luscious Sarasota oyster. Waddy Bacon and Jasper Harris also displayed Sarasota oysters at the 1891 Florida Exposition in Ocala. As Tampa denuded their natural oyster beds, they started harvesting in Terracea Bay and then Sarasota Bay. They would advertise the Sarasota oyster for many years, even after they decimated the natural beds in Sarasota Bay. They would ship Sarasota oysters up north, where they were enjoyed, increasing the demand for the premium product. In January of 1897, the Manatee River Journal reported, "The Sarasota oyster sign is still very frequent in Tampa, but very little, if any, oysters go into that city from Sarasota. The great quantity of this popular food used in that city comes up in an open state from Punta Gorda by rail 120 miles. The demise of the Sarasota oysters, from the Manatee River Journal. September 1st, 1892. In the different arms of Tampa Bay, there were once, and to some extent are now, great natural beds of delicious oysters. But as Tampa grew to be a city, and its inhabitants developed a taste for these luscious bivalves, these beds suffered. Those of Terracea Bay were demolished in a single season. Year by year, the spoliation has proceeded until now nearly all of those fine beds in the vicinity of Sarasota are almost exhausted. And if the depredations of these Tampa thieves are not stopped, the once noted oysters of Manatee County will soon be but a name and a story. Note, at this time, Little Sarasota Bay included what is now Roberts Bay near Siesta Key, to the mangroves, a spot near the outlet of Philippi Creek, and below to Casey Key. This was the last area to be raided due to the shallowness and mangroves blocking the way. This area was initially dredged by the Corps of Engineers from 1907 to 1917 for boat traffic. October 26, 1893. The Tampa Times advertises daily fresh Sarasota oysters at Tampa Fish and Ice Companies. To him who can read between the lines, it means that where a few years ago there were oyster bars in every bay and inlet, in a time not far away there will not be an oyster on the coast of Manatee County. June 7, 1894. The Tampa oyster boats, after years, have nearly ruined our great oyster beds. The immense drain upon the fish of our waters cannot go on forever, and we doubt not Tampa will some day swoop down upon the clam bars which will be left. We are a singularly helpless people. April 4th, 1895. We have seen these bays yielding an immense quantity of the finest oysters, and we have seen these natural oyster bars robbed in the most wanton fashion, until at present Lower Sarasota Bay contains the only important natural beds which remain. This condition has resulted from the reckless and reprehensible way the oyster robbers had of gathering oysters. During low tides, when a cold north wind was blowing, they would take up everything without regard to future results, and then go to some sheltered spot and cull out what they wanted and throw the rest away. This practically left nothing on the natural bars for the oyster spawn to cling to, and now what were once natural bars are so only in name, and unless something is done to restore the natural conditions by planting shells of young oysters upon these so-called natural bars, they will remain barren for many years to come. May 30th, 1901. But being free to everybody, dozens of oyster boats came winter after winter from Tampa and St. Petersburg and carried away almost everything except the water and sandy bottom. One winter, a few years ago, one man from Tampa alone dug 1,400 barrels of oysters, which he sold for 50 cents a barrel, and a Tampa oyster dealer, who had several boats, acknowledged that he took 4,200 barrels of oysters from the bay in a single season. And now, as direct result of that foolish and destructive policy of making oysters free to everybody, I do not believe that a man could find 50 barrels of really good oysters on all the entire oyster bottom recently applied for by the several residents along the bay, if he was to work hard for 6 months to find them. The fact is, the oysters are not there, and the worst of it is, there is nothing left for the oyster spawn to cling to, and if nothing is done to restore former conditions, and if this senseless policy of making them free to everybody is to prevail, then it may be accepted as the result that oysters will hereafter be exceedingly scarce and of little account in Little Sarasota Bay. It is a fact that young oysters have been taken from the bay to be transplanted near Tampa, and the property owners along the bay have been obliged to see the destructive work go on, utterly powerless to prevent it. And while this allowing the oysters to be free to everybody has made them scarce to everybody and almost unattainable. July 4th, 1901. Mr. Drumright admitted that the Tampa oystermen had cleaned out the oyster bars, and he said he was told that as soon as the oysters grew again, the Tampa men will come with guns to repeat the operation. Oyster Laws and Rulings. Manatee River Journal, July 6, 1893. The oyster has been provided for in that they shall only be taken from their beds from September 1st to May 1st, requiring further that they be culled and the culls returned to the beds. Sarasota Times, September 11th, 1913. The new law for the protection of shellfish will go in effect October 1st. This provides that no oysters shall be taken from the waters before October 1st or later than April 1st. Manatee River Journal, February 6, 1902. An important decision. Man has a right to protect his own property, from the Jacksonville Times-Union and Citizen. The facts in the shooting of Leo C. Corwin by Frank L. Henderson came out in court at Tampa on the 25th. Henderson was charged with assault with intent to murder, and the preliminary hearing was held before Judge F.M. Robles of the county court. Mr. Henderson owns an extensive oyster bed down the bay, which is granted to him by the county. He has been troubled with persons who claim rights on the bar and take the oysters from there without paying for them. It was alleged that Corwin was one of those who had been taking oysters, and some time ago he was arrested on a warrant sworn out by Mr. Henderson, the charge being stealing oysters. The case became entangled in the meshes of the law, and nothing was done. Then Mr. Henderson issued an edict on his own account. He saw Corwin in his boat on the bar, it is said, and told him he must not take the oysters. He testified that Corwin dropped the tongs and brought up more oysters. He then told Corwin that if the tongs went into the water again, he would fill him with shot. The tongs dipped into the water, and Mr. Henderson raised his gun and fired. The rocking of the boat made the main part of the load strike the mast of Corwin's boat, but the load glanced and filled his head full of shot, which gave him some trouble. The hearing on Saturday resulted in the discharge of Henderson, the court holding that a man had the right to protect his own property when it was being destroyed or taken away. From the Manatee River Journal, February 27, 1902. Granting rights to maternal oyster bars. It is admitted that such rights cannot be granted, but when a former maternal bar has been denuded of all oysters by the reckless methods employed by the Tampa and St. Petersburg oystermen, leaving for the most part only a sandy bottom with nothing even for oyster spawn to cling to, it is the height of absurdity to consider it still a maternal oyster bar, and no court in the state would so maintain it, requiring a score of years to have it again stocked with oysters by the slow process of nature. But when the county grants rights to plant oysters thereon, and the holder of such right proceeds to do so by expenditure of time and money, and so helps to restore former conditions of a plentiful oyster supply, no court will fail to uphold him when he protects his property from highwaymen like robbers. Sarasota Times, September 28, 1916. Oyster beds must be marked. The War Department has issued the following regulations pertaining to shellfish and oysters. Owners are authorized to place buoys and stakes under engineers' orders. Manatee River Journal, June 19, 1902. Curious case in court from the Tampa Daily Times. The state's right to lease oyster bars questioned. There is an interesting case in equity in process of being heard before Judge Wall at present. It seems that sometime last year the county commissioners of Manatee County leased some oyster bars along the coastline of the county to E.R. Marsh and George H. Matheny, and the leasers have since that time prohibited other parties from taking oysters from the bars in question. A short time ago, Elof Peterson entered suit against these parties and claimed that the leasing of these bars by the county commissioners were illegal, asking an injunction against Mr. Marsh and Mr. Matheny, exercising the exclusive right of taking oysters from these bars. Sarasota Times, December 8, 1921. The court recognizes state control of oyster beds. By a decision of the United States Supreme Court, exclusive state rights over natural and artificial oyster beds is recognized. The High Court has held that a state has complete control over the lease or operation of its natural or other oyster beds, federal rules and regulations to the contrary notwithstanding. County approving private oyster beds. In November 1894, John G. Webb petitioned to have exclusive rights to plant a denuded oyster bar next to his property in Osprey. In January of 1895, the petition was granted in accordance with a statute in such cases and provided. The requirements were the petitioner must own land bordering the requested plot, and the plot must not be a maternal bed of oysters. It must be either a denuded bar or barren of any active oyster culture. Since that time, the Board of Manatee County Commissioners quite often had a portion of their meetings devoted to receiving petitions for planting oysters. The petitions were held for a month or more while the county surveyor would inspect the requested sites. If the survey came back okay and there was no dissenting motions, the petitions were normally granted. Another requirement was that the granted areas had to have their boundaries marked by stakes or buoys set not more than 50 feet apart to not interfere with navigation and to be kept standing and in good order. Manatee River Journal, April 4, 1895. While seeming to be a great loss, we believe the destruction of the Sarasota Bay oyster beds to have been a good benefit. The growing population of our county requires oysters. The metropolis at the head of the bay demand an enormous quantity, and the opportunity is offered our citizens to engage in the least risky and one of the best paying industries which any may be entered into, that of oyster farming. Manatee River Journal, March 21, 1901. Some of the citizens living on the shore of Little Sarasota Bay, feeling the great importance of preserving the oysters and willing to do the work necessary to restore former conditions, have had surveys made and asked the county commissioners to grant the proper rights to secure the benefits resulting from their efforts to sow oyster shells upon the old bars and allow the oysters to grow again. Manatee River Journal, May 30th, 1901. But seriously, the property owners along Little Sarasota Bay are actuated by a very reasonable desire to preserve the oysters, which have made the bay famous, and there is no purpose or intention to create a monopoly or shut anybody out of having all the oysters they want. But for one thing, they have set their faces against the reckless robbing of the bay of its oysters by the Tampa boats, which have heretofore taken away thousands of dollars worth of oysters without any return whatever. And the property owners must respectfully appeal to the Board of County Commissioners, who are regarded as men of intelligence and common sense, to grant such rights as well enable the applicants not only to cultivate the oysters, but to prevent the oystermen from a distance from cleaning out the bars so completely as they have done in the past. 1915-1916 Sarasota Times report of the oyster beds that generate revenue for Florida. This does not include the previous list of petitioners to grow their own oyster bars, which do not generate revenue for the state. Almost all of the listed oyster bars are in the Little Sarasota Bay, includes today's Roberts Bay and below. Note the amount of acreage Bertha Palmer has to raise oysters, 158.23 acres. Thieves, Manatee River Journal, November 15, 1888. Somebody made a raid on Mr. Harris's oyster bed one night last week. Sarasota Times, January 9, 1913. Jessie Shumard is employed these starlit evenings watching Mrs. Palmer's oyster bars. Why such employment has been necessary, I leave to the reader to infer, but it is a consolation to know that statistics say 98% of us are honest. Penalties for taking oysters unlawfully are light. Manatee River Journal, November 16, 1899. The Fish and Game Warden arrested 2 parties last week for violating the oyster law, and on Saturday they were convicted and each fined $5 in costs by our local Justice of the Peace. Manatee River Journal, 1901, August 8th. County Court. Of the cases contested, only one conviction was secured, and that for taking oysters from a bar in the river, which has never been regarded as an oyster bar from which edible oysters could be secured by many of the oldest inhabitants. May 10th, 1907, Manatee River Journal. County Court. Sam Mariner, unlawfully taking oysters, pled guilty, $1 in costs. Melly Mariner, unlawfully taking oysters, pled guilty, $1 in costs. John Mariner, unlawfully taking oysters, pled guilty, $1 in costs. You may have heard of the Guptills, especially if you have visited their house at Spanish Point. You may have noticed in earlier slides that Frank Guptill applied for raising oyster beds 3 times. When Bertha Palmer bought out the Webb estate, the Guptils moved to his cottage on Siesta Key. In August of 1912, Frank died, leaving his oyster bars to his wife. Here are the ads Mrs. Guptil put in the Sarasota Times in January and February of 1913. The ad, entitled "Stealing Oysters," expresses her outrage at the theft from her registered oyster bed. Stealing oysters. For 3 years my husband has been caring for a crop of oysters, which this winter he was to have harvested, and he estimated that these would be 600 barrels. But he was called away, and I am unable to get anyone to harvest them for me, because thieves have been taking them from my beds at night and selling them for less than an honest man could do and pay me anything for them. So Sarasota and vicinity has been supplied with stolen oysters this winter. Now I am going to throw the beds open to the public. People may, with my consent, go there and pick up oysters, paying me a small charge. Some will pay, I'm sure, while many will take them for nothing. But as $1 is all that I have received for oysters this winter, 50 cents now and then will be acceptable. See ad in another column. Mrs. Frank Guptil. If you go boating on Sarasota Bay or to the south, you will probably have noticed an occasional oyster bar, some above the water during low tide and some in the mangroves. Thank you for attending the early history of the Sarasota Bay oysters.